Before time began, there was the cube.
You got the touch. You got the power. Yeah!
"2024 will be a year of many elections, and the very first to cover is from the nation of Taiwan. Although a relatively small nation, around only half the size of Scotland, Taiwan's unique position on the world stage makes its significance punch far above its own weight. The election was down to three main parties. The first is the Democratic Progressive Party, which already held power going into the election. The DPP, as the name suggests, is generally considered a progressive centre-left party within Taiwan, supporting moderate social welfare, democratic systems of government, and generally more progressive social values. Most notably, the party advocates for a strengthening of Taiwan's national identity, which comes under the backdrop of China's infamous One China policy. The One China policy, for those who may have forgotten, is a principle held by the nation of China, that Taiwan has and always will be a part of mainland China. Because of this position, most governments actually don't recognize Taiwan as its own country, as doing so would mean having to cut ties with China, a nation that has a lot of weight on the world stage. This has led to a funny position where many nations have what are called representative and trade and branch offices within Taiwan, which are basically embassies, but definitely not embassies. In any case, the Democratic Progressive Party basically saw what China did to Hong Kong and thought, no thanks. The second contender was the Kuomintang Party, or what it was known initially, the Nationalist Party of China. As you might imagine, a party with such a name is much friendlier to the One China policy, and believes Taiwanese independence to be unnecessary. For the Kuomintang Party, a Taiwanese identity is needlessly provocative to China, a nation that almost certainly has a comprehensive plan to invade the island tucked inside Xi Jinping's bedside drawer. It should be noted that while the Kuomintang Party is far more aligned with China, the Democratic Progressive Party favors closer ties with more democratic nations, such as Japan and the United States. Taiwan is famously the leading nation when it comes to the manufacturing of semiconductors, a fundamental component of modern electronic devices, and presumably half of the characters from 2007's action blockbuster Transformers. Semiconductors are also predominantly used in nearly all modern weapon systems, which is why the United States has been particularly invested in Taiwan staying independent. In the enormous geopolitical game of chess, this is arguably why the United States is so interested in protecting Ukraine. If the much weaker Russia is able to invade its neighbor with impunity, the Chinese government may conclude that it will be able to do the same with Taiwan, an ally that the United States cannot afford to lose. The third main contender was the Taiwanese People's Party, a relatively new competitor which was only established in 2019. The TPP brands itself as something as a middle ground between the long-established competing parties, taking the stance that the nation should secure closer ties with China, while also maintaining its independence. The Taiwan People's Party has been especially popular among younger voters within Taiwan, as its platform was less concerned with Chinese relations, and more focused on other issues such as education and housing. A lot of younger Taiwanese citizens don't like the prospect of being absorbed into China and losing their political freedom. But at the same time, they're acutely aware that if China were to attack, they'll be the ones who will actually have to die in Taiwan's defense. In this sense, a middle ground is seen to be very appealing. The results of the general election eventually saw the Democratic Progressive Party winning with around 40% of the vote, followed by Kuomintang at 33%, and finally the Taiwan People's Party sitting at 26.5%. On the world stage, this election was quite a clear rebuttal of China's claim to the region, as this is now the third election running which has been won by the independence-minded Democratic Progressive Party. China has since responded to the election results by stating, quote, "Taiwan needs to be disabused of biases against China." This point would soon be contradicted by yet another militaristic show of force. We can't make this shit up. Taiwan currently stands as the 10th most democratic nation on Earth, but needless to say, the next 4 years are going to be interesting. Longtime viewers will know that our stories generally fall into two main categories: shit that will be written into a history book, and shit funny enough that people will wish it had been written into a history book. This story is the latter. On the 8th of January, at least 10 members of a Jewish synagogue in New York City were arrested, following a brawl with police over the discovery of an illegal secret tunnel running underneath their building of worship, the Chabad Lubavitch World Headquarters. This synagogue in Crown Heights is world famous in the Jewish community, attracting thousands from all over the world to worship and study at its location. The late leader, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, who passed away in 1994, remains an influential figure to this day. His influence was so strong over the past several decades that it caused some members of the Chabad Lubavitch to splinter off into a separate group known as Messichists. Some Messichists believe that Schneerson is the Messiah and soon to return to the earth, while others believe that he never died in the first place. Fast forward to more recent times, when a small group of Messichist students in the Chabad Lubavitch community, convinced they were being commanded by Schneerson to expand the synagogue, had a brilliant idea. Without the approval from the city of New York or the synagogue, they were going to build a secret tunnel. Just like the tunnels constructed in the desert by the Decepticon Scorponok in Michael Bay's 2007 film Transformers. The tunnel was constructed over an unknown period of time with unregulated handheld digging tools. The tunnel itself is 8 feet wide and 60 feet long, or around 18 by 2.5 meters for any freedom-hating communists in the audience. Upon the tunnel's discovery, the property manager for the Chabad Lubavitch World Headquarters called in builders and city officials to seal the tunnel, prompting the group of Messichist students to gather inside to prevent its untimely end. It was this protest inside the synagogue which caused the sensational story to make headlines, and police to be called to the scene. Following a brawl with NYPD officers, at least 10 people were arrested, with up to 12 different people being charged with a scattering of crimes. These include criminal mischief, attempted criminal mischief, disorderly conduct, reckless endangerment, and at least 2 individual charges of an attempted hate crime. Rabbi Moti Seligson, a spokesperson for Chabad, said the underground passage was built by the group of young agitators because they were seeking unauthorized access to the synagogue. Other community speculation pointed towards the need to expand the synagogue sides to combat overcrowding, which has been an issue for many years due to the location's popularity. The buildings adjacent to the tunnel were given vacate orders due to the growing concerns of foundational instability and fire safety. New York law enforcement agencies would successfully seal the tunnel a day after the incident, due to its lack of structural integrity or any adherence to construction regulations. As always, we'll provide updates in the future for any more tunnel-related news stories. But in the meantime, here's a shitpost that Swag insisted we include.
I mean, after watching Hamas in Gaza, you think maybe the Jews in New York thought to themselves, not bad. Like, hey, Abraham, go get us some shovels. And maybe some kippa hats that glow in the dark.
On the second day of January, passengers in the Tokyo Haneda airport were greeted with an unusual scene, when at around 8:45 p.m., a fireball erupted on one of the runways. A Japan Airlines Airbus A350-900 carrying 379 people had just crashed into the Japanese Coast Guard Dash 8 turboprop. For an unknown reason, the Coast Guard Dash 8 entered onto the runway and was preparing to take off, while at the same time the A350 touched down at over 165 miles an hour. The A350 collided with the much smaller Dash 8, with both aircraft immediately erupting into flames. The Dash 8 suffered serious damage in the impact, killing 5 members of its 6-man crew, with only the pilot surviving with serious injuries. The A350, meanwhile, suffered a collapsed front landing gear and a rapidly worsening fire. After skidding to a stop, the airliner was successfully evacuated, with all 379 people escaping with only a few minor injuries. Emergency services were on the scene within 3 minutes, but unfortunately both aircraft were destroyed in the ensuing fire. fire. This marks the first time an A350 has been destroyed in a crash or accident. Initial review indicated that the Dash A entered the runway without clearance, while the A350 crew failed to spot the aircraft's lights on the runway. The accident is under investigation, however, so until its conclusion, we won't exactly know why the crash occurred, or why there were two planes on the same runway at the same time. One silver lining to the crash, however, was that it proved the safety of newer carbon fiber aircraft. The destroyed A350 was less than 2 years old and made of 53% carbon fiber, far more than any other civilian plane made by Airbus. Early studies indicated that carbon fibers can resist much higher temperatures than traditional aluminium builds, and don't burn as easily, though they begin to weaken sooner. When the A350 caught fire in Japan, the carbon fiber cabin withstood 1,700 degrees Celsius, or 3,000 degree Fahrenheit flames for several hours, granting the passengers enough time to escape, before finally collapsing under the intense heat. The events of the collision proved that carbon fibers can withstand the violent shock of a crash and subsequent fire, confirming the study's findings. With this in mind, the A350 airframe was still found to be far weaker than the Lockheed Martin F-22 Raptor disguise used by the Decepticon Starscream in 2007's Transformers. Just 3 days later, an Alaska Airlines Boeing 737 MAX 9 was climbing at 16,000 feet, when suddenly a door plug was blown out, leaving behind a large hole in the side of the cabin. Fortunately, no passengers were sucked out of the breach, though 2 iPhones unfortunately fell back to Earth, one of which actually surviving. Aviation experts remarked that had this instead been a Nokia 3310, the resulting impact would have made a crater the size of a small hospital. In quite a fortunate stroke of luck, the passengers assigned to the window and middle seats of the row happened to miss their flight, leaving both seats empty and allowing the plane to land without reporting any injuries. Viewers might recall that this plane type was the same involved in 2 high-profile crashes that occurred at the end of 2018 and the start of 2019. In these incidents, passengers were not so lucky, as both crashes unfortunately had no survivors. Boeing's MAX was grounded worldwide for nearly 2 years following these incidents, while the company made extensive redesigns to the autopilot system. Since they returned to the skies during the pandemic, there were no significant events until the door plug blowout. Unlike the earlier crashes, however, the groundings are limited to a specific version of the model, as the faulty doors in the other versions are permanently bolted to the larger frame. These 2 accidents are concerning for obvious reasons, but paradoxically, it also serves to show just how far safety in the aviation industry has come. The 2 accidents involved a total of 562 people, with only 5 deaths, none of whom were passengers. Earlier accidents of a similar nature were typically catastrophic, with no survivors being a common occurrence. Parts falling off of an aircraft are still bad, but you can rest a little easier on your next holiday, knowing that flying is still technically the safest mode of transportation. As always, you have a higher chance of being killed or injured in the white Toyota Corolla that drove you to the airport. January now marks 5 years of news without the bullshit. And if there's one thing we've learned, it's that no one news source is perfect. This is why today's sponsor, Ground News, is exceptionally helpful. Ground News draws from over 50,000 news sources from all over the world and compiles them on a per-story basis, so you'll always get the full picture. In this example, this story is about the richest 5 people in the world doubling their money since the start of the decade. From the Bias Insights feature, we can see that left-leaning sources focused primarily on wealth disparity, while right-leaning publications called for a need to break up monopolies. To go even further, users can also see a breakdown of each source's political leanings, their factuality rating, and even who owns the publication. From here, we might notice even deeper insights. For example, although the story was reported by quite a high number of sources, it was not covered by the Washington Post, a publication owned by Jeff Bezos. Social media platforms have become a breeding ground for misinformation, and will often just show users content that aligns perfectly with their worldview. The best way to stay informed is to break out of these filtered bubbles and be exposed to new perspectives. Some of your opinions might change, others will be reinforced, but overall, you'll be a more informed person as a result. By going to ground.news/sirswag, or just clicking the link in the description like a normal person, you'll be able to get 30% off unlimited access to the Vantage plan, which is about $5 a month. This will score unlimited access to everything Ground News has to offer. But best of all is the My News Bias feature. This is where you can see a comprehensive breakdown of things like the sources you've used, the topics, your civil lens, and a bias breakdown. It's like having a Fitbit for the news. We can only cover news for one day a month, but in the meantime, ground news really is the place to be. Meanwhile, Vietnam pledges to reform its human rights laws by the end of the century. North Korea pushes its tourism industry, and a Florida school district bans dictionaries for inappropriate content. Viewers with long memories might be able to cast their minds back to the very final days of 2019. President Donald Trump had just been impeached for the first time. Australia was on fire, and Twitter had recently banned any form of political advertising on the platform. The nation of Russia had also been caught up in a doping scandal, a humiliation which would see the country banned from all global sport for 4 whole years. As crazy as this sounds, by the end of 2019, people were genuinely excited and optimistic for 2020 to finally come around. The controversy around President Trump had finally reached its peak. The entire world could stop getting so hot, and finally Twitter could become a place absent of political misinformation. Although it would be a tough 4 years for athletes within Russia, by the end of 2023 they could finally rejoin the rest of the international community with open arms, knowing that the nation had learned to play nice with its neighbors. There might have been some small reports of a guy in China who got sick after eating a Pokemon, but other than that, 2020 was going to be a good year. We say all of this because obviously the world went to absolute shit almost immediately after the new year came round. But quite arguably, the very first sign that something wasn't right took place in Iraq on the 3rd of January. At 12:47 AM, a United States Reaper drone launched several missiles at a convoy leaving the Damascus International Airport, killing 10 people, most notably Iranian General Qasem Soleimani. Soleimani's assassination by the US government was justified by officials as a response to a series of attacks against US troops in Iraq, while other experts have since called the strike a violation of international law. The legality of killing 10 people aside, Qasem Soleimani was quite the prominent figure within Iran, and decisive to say the least. To the United States, Soleimani was the head of a state-sponsored terrorist organization, and the second most powerful person in Iran. However, when we were able to speak to an Iranian citizen shortly after Soleimani's death, it seemed as if he was extremely popular within the nation, even among those who didn't necessarily approve of the Iranian government. To the Iranian public, he was a war hero, a public figure, and a leader who almost had a rock star-like quality within the nation. To his critics, however, Soleimani was still a pillar of a brutal regime, one we've since covered numerous times for killing hundreds of anti-government protesters. In any case, Qasem Soleimani was respected across deeply divided factional lines, which led to a strained relationship between the US and Iran becoming even more bitter. An Iranian lawmaker would even put a $3 million bounty on the head of Donald Trump following the strike, enough to run the entire US military for nearly 2 whole minutes. Viewers may recognize the very same military from around 50% of the scenes featured in 2007's science fiction action film Transformers. Qasem Soleimani's death was mourned nationwide, with millions attending the mourning procession, and by the 7th of January, 56 people had been killed by a stampede at his burial. The cultural effect of Soleimani's death was not quite as significant within America, however, with the most notable reference to his likeness appearing in the opening mission of 2022's Modern Warfare 2. In this mission, players are tasked with assassinating Iranian General Ghobrani with a missile strike, a character who looks and sounds suspiciously like Qasem Soleimani. Truly an America moment. With this absolute mountain of context more or less over, we can actually report on why this is even important. On the 3rd of January this year, on the 4-year anniversary of Soleimani's death, a pair of bombs went off at a commemorative ceremony to remember the deceased general. The Afghanistan-based ISIS branch would claim responsibility for the attack, and it would later be reported that 94 people had been killed in the explosions. Although perhaps surprising, ISIS had initially celebrated the US decision to kill Soleimani, as he had been instrumental in driving them out of Iraq and defeating them within Syria. While Iran is mostly made up of Shia Muslims, ISIS is a Sunni extremist organization, a difference that comes with a theological dispute over the succession of the Prophet Muhammad in the 7th century. If this still doesn't make any sense, then don't worry too much, because although Swag wrote this story, he sure as fuck doesn't understand it either. Since the bombings, Iran's supreme leader Ayatollah Khamenei has vowed a harsh response to the perpetrators. Shortly after the attack, Iran's president and vice president blamed Israel for the bombings, which annoyed ISIS on account of all their hard work and annoyed Israel because, quote, "For real guys, we didn't actually do this one, no cap." US intelligence basically went on to say that ISIS absolutely did that shit. When Israel was questioned, it would state that it was already busy fighting Hamas. Iranian intelligence would later report that they believe the mastermind was a Tajikistani national operating from Afghanistan. Aside from ISIS, pretty much every other organized entity on Earth condemned the bombing and expressed sympathy for the hundreds of victims who were caught in the attack. For our next country of interest, we now turn to Ecuador, a nation which was flipped on its head this month. On the first weekend of January, notorious gang leader and organized crime enthusiast José Adolfo Macias staged an escape from the Littoral Penitentiary, the largest prison in Ecuador. The career criminal was planned to be moved to a maximum security prison the day of his escape, but like a scene from The Shawshank Redemption, his cell was instead found to be empty. Macias's escape would soon be followed by President Noboa issuing a state of emergency, which would prompt violent riots breaking out over at least 7 prisons across Ecuador. These riots would result in over 200 taken hostage and cause the deaths of at least 19 people. José Adolfo Macias himself is known as Ecuador's most powerful narco boss, heading the infamous Los Choneros, an organized crime syndicate which has been operating for nearly 2 decades. Some might even compare Macias to the character Megatron from the leader of the antagonistic Decepticons in 2007's hit film Transformers. According to state officials in Ecuador, Los Choneros has been responsible for a broad uptick in violence across the country, and their list of crimes are all the greatest hits you might expect. Along with the usual extortion, kidnappings, and homicides, the syndicate also deals in higher profile work like car bombings and assassinations. Not much is known about the early life of Macias himself, however, as although 13 years into his 34-year prison sentence, details before his life of crime are almost non-existent. Talking to a local newspaper in 2017, Macias's mother would say, quote, "They accuse him of selling drugs, stealing cars, even stealing chickens. For everything that happens in Manta, Macias's hometown, they want to hold him responsible. Mothers truly are the real MVPs." After the escape from Macias and the declared state of emergency by President Noboa, shit within Ecuador got fucking nuts. The very same day a state of emergency was called, armed gunmen broke into a TV station in Guayaquil and took the crew hostage during a live broadcast. The station would later be raided by Ecuadorian police, but not before a journalist was shot in the leg and an employee had his arm broken. The TV station raid would then be followed by attacks at several hospitals, another hostage situation involving police officers, a kidnapping incident at the University of Guayaquil, a gas station being set on fire, explosions being reported in at least 5 different locations, as well as seemingly other random attacks. Just to be clear, this was all on the same day the state of emergency was announced. Banks, markets, and shops in several cities began to shut their doors for fear of an attack. Some nations temporarily closed their embassies within the country, while others sent emergency flights to evacuate citizens. As for the state of emergency itself, the president immediately classified 22 gangs as terrorist organizations and kicked off 75 separate raids against suspected corrupt state officials and police officers. These included the homes of judges and even the country's judicial regulator. Los Choneros has previously been known to have allied with politicians within the nation, meaning they've previously been no stranger to having friends in high places. As of time of writing, the spike in violence within Ecuador seems to have mostly subsided. However, José Adolfo Macias still remains a free man. The last time he escaped from prison in 2013, Macias was recaptured a few weeks later. Whether history repeats itself or Macias learns from his previous mistakes is still yet to be seen. We now swap to something much less controversial, the war between Israel and Hamas. Militarily, the conflict seems to have drastically slowed down since it started in early October, and the start of January saw Israel pull back from many neighborhoods in northern Gaza. The Israeli army would later state, quote, "We have completed the dismantling of the Hamas military framework in the northern Gaza Strip. Now the focus is on dismantling Hamas in the center of the Gaza Strip and the south of the Gaza Strip." Israel's defense minister would later announce that the rest of its campaign will mostly be low-intensity fighting. As for citizens within Gaza itself, the news is still pretty bad. 93% of the population is facing crisis levels of hunger, and 1 in 4 households are actively selling possessions in order to afford food. The lack of food, especially among children, can have lifelong consequences for both growth and cognitive development. Sanitation has also become a huge issue within the region, with an average of only a single shower for every 4,500 people, and only a single toilet per 220. As a result, infectious diseases have become rampant, while its health system has far exceeded its capacity months ago. Internationally, the war within Gaza has taken center stage, with the European Union adopting a resolution calling for a ceasefire, if a pair of conditions are fulfilled. The resolution calls for all hostages within Gaza to be released and Hamas to be dismantled so that a political solution could be found. While the EU Parliament would condemn the attack on Israel by Hamas, it would also denounce Israel's response, which would go on to kill a hugely disproportionate number of civilians. Along with this, the Parliament would also reiterate the need to further a two-state solution within the region and called for Israel to return all territory recognized as a part of Palestine as per the 1967 borders. As for whether this can actually happen, probably not. Only this month, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu stated that he opposed the establishment of a two-state solution, stating, quote, "In any future arrangement, Israel needs security control of all territory west of Jordan." It should be noted that Netanyahu's views are not universally shared among all Israelis, but public support for a two-state solution is evidently quite low. From a survey taken in December 2022, support for a two-state solution sat at 33% among Palestinians and 34% among Israeli Jews. This is markedly down from 2002 figures, where support sat at 72% for both sides. Most of the 2022 respondents believe that the other side would never recognize their independent state. As for Hamas, their policy is just as convoluted. Some seem to accept the 1967 borders and are happy to compromise, while others are more in the death to Israel camp. This month, the South African government has initiated proceedings in the International Court of Justice, alleging that the nation of Israel has committed genocide. The allegations stem from Israel's retaliation since Hamas's October 7th attack, which has been seen by many as disproportional. According to Palestinian data, Israel's campaign into Gaza has so far wiped out an entire 1% of its pre-war population. The IDF itself stated from its own statistics it had killed 2 civilians for every 1 Hamas militant, a figure that a spokesperson stated to be, quote, "tremendously positive." Viewers can take that as they will. It's abundantly clear that Israel's IDF has killed a huge amount of people within Gaza since October, regardless of their connection to Hamas. But whether it qualifies as genocide is still yet to be determined. Genocide itself is pretty much the worst crime in the world, which is why the bar for meeting the definition is particularly high. According to the 1948 Genocide Convention, there are 2 main requirements for an act to be classified as genocide. The first is a physical element and can be of any 5 things. These include, quote, killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. In terms of the physical element, it probably wouldn't be too hard to argue the case for genocide. But step 2 isn't quite as straightforward. Along with the physical act, the accused needs to have, quote, the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethical, racial, or religious group as such. In short, it's not enough to commit these acts. There needs to be a deliberate intention to wipe out a group of people. Standing in for Palestine, South Africa argues that women and children killed within Gaza had nothing to do with the attacks conducted by Hamas. It also argues that collectively punishing the 2.3 million people within Gaza with a blockade certainly looks to be a deliberate attempt to target an entire people. Perhaps some of the most damning evidence presented were quotes from those within Israel with positions of power. After all, it doesn't matter how many Israeli civilians call to wipe out Gaza, because ultimately they're not the ones dictating policy. One major general within the Israeli army stated, quote, "There will be no electricity and no water in Gaza. There will only be destruction. You wanted hell, you will get hell." Another IDF member of the same rank also stated, "Gaza will become a place where no human being can exist." Of course, these are merely a few quotes from the Israeli side, but in the interest of time, let's look at Israel's defense. Israel argues that it has been placed in an impossible position and is merely responding to Hamas's October 7th attack, which killed 1,200 Israeli citizens and left another 240 taken hostage. Israel argues that its actions are therefore in self-defense and that Hamas are the ones with genocidal ambitions. Part of its presentation in court included a series of pictures that featured weapons hidden in the bedrooms of children. From the view of Israel, if Hamas is not wiped out, it will only be a matter of time before an attack like the one on October 7th will be repeated. Although not quite as relevant for such a court case, we figured we'd question our previously mentioned IDF contact, a member of a tank crew who has spent a good part of the recent conflict within Gaza itself. We asked him about the genocide case and received a very extensive reply, so here's the abridged version. Quote, "I can somewhat understand why people come to that conclusion, but it really isn't genocide. We truly do our best to minimize casualties. We do what we can in the scenario we find ourselves in. We drop leaflets before airstrikes. We evacuate medical personnel and patients before clearing out Hamas operating in hospitals. We provide food, medical equipment, and baby food to the evacuees. We have tanks and infantry safeguarding the passage of refugees through the Rafah crossing. We do everything we can to protect innocents. Broken record, but Hamas wants as much death as possible. They do all they can in their power to counter our efforts. And of course, sometimes accidents happen. Sometimes things don't go as planned. All of this is to say, no, we're not doing a genocide. If we are, we're really, really fucking bad at it." He would also be clear to state that he is not an expert on the subject, and that, quote, "Of course, I'm as biased as you can get, right? I'm a tanker operating in Gaza." From the perspective of scholars, it seems as if the majority are inclined to side against Israel, although many admit that proving intent may be challenging. US intelligence, on the other hand, has stated that around 40 to 45% of all bombs dropped on Gaza are unguided munitions, which pose a greater threat to civilians. Not exactly an ideal weapon for one of the most densely populated places in the world. The International Court of Justice could make an emergency ruling as soon as February, which would order Israel to conduct an immediate ceasefire while more evidence can be examined. Israel itself has stated that if this were to happen, it would not be able to comply with such an order, as while they would be forced to cease military operations, Hamas would be under no such obligation. In any case, it will likely take several years before the court can reach a final ruling. As previously feared, it also seems as if the conflict has spread to other regions in the Middle East, a region heavily featured in Hasbro's 2007 hit film Transformers. More specifically, Iran-backed Houthi groups who expressed support for Hamas at the start of this most recent conflict within Gaza. These groups have spent several months launching attacks on commercial ships traveling through the Red Sea. Although initially stating to only target ships bound for Israel, these groups would later attack ships indiscriminately. By the end of December last year, the United States shot down a total of 24 Houthi missiles and drones, and deployed ships to the region to protect shipping lanes. This was partly because 50 different nations use these lanes for maritime shipping, and partly because sky-high shipping costs is bad for literally everyone on Earth. By the 3rd of January, the United States said something along the lines of, "You can either stop immediately or personally find out why US citizens don't have healthcare." An important detail to note is that US intelligence is really fucking good at figuring out the perfect spot to drop down weaponized American freedom. And in the months of attacks against Red Sea ships, they were taking plenty of notes. In the first wave alone, the United States simultaneously launched 22 fixed-wing aircraft and 80 Tomahawk cruise missiles towards 16 separate locations. The second wave would fire another 50 missiles, while the UK would provide additional support. Following the operation, 2 US officials would estimate that the strikes had damaged or destroyed around 20 to 30% of the Houthis' offensive capability, but admitted it had been challenging to locate their targets. Internationally, nations either supported the strikes to protect commercial shipping within the region or criticized the operation as escalating tensions. The funniest reaction was by far from the Hamas-aligned Hezbollah militant group, who said the strikes will, quote, "harm the security of all maritime navigation." We couldn't write satire this funny. With the war in Gaza seeming to be taken down a notch, we can only hope that the region stops making headlines for all the wrong reasons. If tensions can be cooled and relative peace can be restored, perhaps the millions of starving or displaced civilians within the region can finally rebuild their now shattered lives. On screen is the current self-reported death toll for the conflict, a number we can only hope remains steady. Our stories are finally over, but that doesn't mean the good times have to stop. This month marks the 5th year of the News Without the Bullshit series, and we have no plans to stop anytime soon. What started as a weekly series that Swag hoped to smash out in an afternoon slowly morphed into monthly episodes that take nearly 10 people 2 whole weeks to put together. This is why we'd like to thank our incredible Patreon supporters for getting us this far, because over the years, their support has bailed us out more times than Swag would care to admit. Exclusive content and a way to get your name in the credits aside, we have other matters at hand. Last month, we launched our yearly survey, and it gave us some very interesting findings. Firstly, it seems as if the overwhelming majority of people prefer our new human narrator. This is excellent news for me, for getting to keep my job, and even better for Swag for not having to use an 18-year-old text-to-speech software designed as a teaching aid for dyslexic German children. It also seems that most people like our current intros and thumbnails, but we'll do our best to try and improve where we can. As for the format, most viewers preferred us to keep a monthly news schedule, something that also made Swag very happy. Quite interestingly, most people actually prefer the news to be quite a bit longer than we expected. So it's good to know that we can push the runtime if it's a particularly eventful month. In terms of our actual reporting, our rating hasn't changed much from previous years, with most viewers rating it around a 9, a score that is usually achieved by some of the most reliable outlets, something ground news. As for our level of bias, around 60% of the viewers rated us to have little to no bias, while 36% rated us to be slightly left-leaning. The slightly left-leaning percentage actually increased 6% from our survey last year, which left us annoyed at ourselves that we didn't ask viewers to explain their reasoning. With this in mind, we'd very much welcome viewers to explain where they would rate our level of bias and why down in the comments, so we can better understand how to better center our reporting. As Jake the analyst is a data scientist, he figured he'd also try to look for trends in the data. He would later find it, quote, fucking astonishing when not a single correlation could be found between questions. Our viewers should take that as they will. The last few bits of information were regarding our second channel, Sir Swag Academy, where it seemed a majority of the respondents wanted episodes featuring interesting people from outside of the team. Feedback we've already acted upon. Sir Swag Academy itself has just gone through a very nice visual upgrade, and episodes of Season 2 are already out. Viewers who might be looking for videos by the team, which are a bit more relaxed, can check us out with the link below. With another month over, we cannot return to a life before the news.
5 years later, and fate has yielded its reward. A series to keep us awake at night. We live among the headlines now, hiding in plain sight, but watching over them in secret. Waiting, protecting. We have witnessed their capacity for bullshit. And although we are worlds apart, like us, there's more to them than meets the eye. I am Cody the narrator, and I send this message to any surviving news enjoyers taking refuge among the stars. Until next month, have a fucking good one.